Welcome back to Strange Epochs. I'm Sean Spainhour, and this is the show where we take one strange, true, documented moment from somewhere in the long and bewildering span of human history, and we sit with it. New episodes every Tuesday. Sources are always in the episode description. This week, we are going to London, October 17th, 1814, a Monday afternoon in the parish of St. Giles, one of the most overcrowded and desperately poor neighborhoods in one of the most overcrowded and desperately poor cities on earth. At roughly 5:30 in the evening, a iron hoop on a 22-foot tall wooden fermentation vat at the Moo and Company Horseshoe Brewery snapped. The vat, which contained the equivalent of approximately 3,500 barrels of fermenting porter, a dark, heavy ale, popular in working-class London, ruptured. The pressure of the escaping liquid struck the adjacent vats in a chain reaction. The back wall of the brewery, 2.5 bricks thick, collapsed outward. Somewhere between 128,000 and 323,000 imperial gallons of beer. The estimates vary, depending on which vats are counted, poured into the streets of St. Giles at the speed of a wave. 8 people died. 5 of them were mourners at an Irish wake for a 2-year-old boy who had died the previous day. A mother and daughter, taking tea, were killed when the flood collapsed their house. A girl was killed in the street. An elderly woman died of the shock. The brewery was taken to court. The court ruled it was an act of God. The brewery not only avoided paying compensation, but received a refund of the excise duty it had already paid on the lost beer, plus additional compensation from Parliament for the lost product. The victims' families received nothing. This is the London beer flood, a story about beer, certainly. Also, a story about poverty, about industrial London, about the specific geometry of who bears the cost of industrial accidents when the law has not yet caught up with the industry, and a story about what happens to ordinary people on an ordinary Monday afternoon when the extraordinary arrives without warning. Let's begin. New Street, St. Giles, London, October 17th, 1814, late afternoon. Anne Saville is in her cellar apartment, mourning. The wake has a specific quality that the historical accounts preserve. It is not simply grief in a room. It is grief organized according to the specific tradition that Irish Catholic communities maintained around death. The body present, the community gathered, the prayers said in rotation, the sharing of what food and drink the household could provide, the stories about the dead person, the keeping of vigil through the hours until the burial. For a 2-year-old child, the rituals are the same as for an adult. The tradition does not shorten itself. For the young dead, the women in the cellar are doing what the tradition requires. They are present, they are praying, they are keeping Anne company in the specific and awful loneliness of a parent's first hours after a child's death. They are the community, functioning as the community is supposed to function. And they are in a basement apartment in St. Giles, which means they are below street level, which means that when the flood arrives, there is nowhere to go. Her 2-year-old son, John, died the previous day. She has laid him out in the cellar in the manner of the Irish Catholic tradition she brought with her from across the water, the body prepared and displayed, the neighbors gathered, the candles lit, the prayers said, the community present in its grief. Several women from the neighborhood are with her. Irish women, neighbors, the specific community of people who came from the same place and ended up in the same desperate corner of London, and who look after each other in the way that displaced communities always look after each other. They are waiting for the men to come home from work so the wake can continue properly. Upstairs, on the first floor of the same building, a woman named Mary Banfield is sitting down for tea with her 4-year-old daughter, Hannah. It is the ordinary domestic moment of the late afternoon. The kettle has boiled, the light is going. Outside, the narrow street is doing what narrow streets in Saint Giles always do at this hour, filling with the sounds of returning workers, children, the cries of street vendors, the general noise of 50,000 people packed into a district built for far fewer. Neither woman knows that 2 streets away, at the Horseshoe Brewery on Tottenham Court Road, a 700-pound iron hoop has just slipped from a 22-foot tall wooden fermentation vat. The brewery's storehouse clerk, George Crick, has noticed the slipped hoop and written a note to one of the partners. He is holding the note when the vat explodes. The sound is heard 5 miles away. The back wall of the brewery, 2.5 bricks thick, 25 feet high, collapses outward. Bricks arc through the air and land on rooftops on Great Russell Street. The chain reaction among the adjacent vats adds their contents to the initial surge. And the combined volume of fermenting porter, dark and thick and moving fast, pours through the gap in the wall and into the streets behind the brewery. It reaches New Street in minutes. The wave is approximately 15 feet high when it hits. In the cellar where Anne Saville is mourning her son, the women gathered around the small body have no warning. The flood does not announce itself. One moment, the candles are burning and the prayers are being said, and the grief is doing what grief does in those long hours after a child's death. The next, the wall gives way and the beer comes in. Upstairs, Mary Banfield and her daughter Hannah are still at their tea. The house collapses. Act 1. The brewery, the neighborhood, and the vat. To understand the London beer flood, you need to understand 3 things that are each strange in their own right. What the Horseshoe Brewery was, what St. Giles was, and what a 19th century porter vat actually was. Because the specific horror of October 17th, 1814 was not simply a vat breaking, it was a vat breaking in exactly the wrong place, at exactly the wrong time, in a configuration that the industrial city had made possible, and the law had done nothing to prevent. The Moose and Company Horseshoe Brewery stood at the corner of Great Russell Street and Tottenham Court Road, in what is now the heart of central London, near the British Museum. In 1814, it was one of the largest breweries in England, one of a small number of enormous porter brewing establishments that had transformed the London brewing industry over the previous half-century. Porter was the dominant drink of working-class London, a dark, heavily fermented ale named for the porters and laborers who drank it, cheaper and more available than spirits, sold in public houses throughout the city, and drunk in enormous quantities by the working population. Moo and Company produced over 100,000 barrels of porter per year. To produce and store that quantity of beer, the brewery had constructed enormous wooden fermentation vats, vessels of a scale that had no real precedent in traditional brewing. The vat that failed on October 17th was 22 feet tall and 30 feet in diameter, bound together with approximately 60 massive iron hoops. It had been holding approximately 3,500 barrels of fermenting porter, a quantity of liquid whose weight and pressure, when released suddenly, was equivalent to a small industrial explosion. These vats were engineering achievements, and like many engineering achievements of the early industrial period, they were built with ambition and deployed before the full implications of their failure modes were understood. Porter had a specific social meaning in London that went beyond its status as a popular drink. It was the drink of the laboring class at a time when the water supply in most parts of London was too contaminated to drink safely. The Thames was an open sewer. The wells in working-class neighborhoods drew from groundwater that was routinely polluted by the cesspits and privies of the densely packed housing above. Drinking water made people sick. Beer, which went through a fermentation process that killed most pathogens, was safer than water for most people in most parts of the city. The brewery was not simply a commercial operation. It was, in a real sense, part of the public health infrastructure of a city that had not yet built a proper one. The giant vats that would eventually kill 8 people in St. Di. Giles were producing the liquid that kept hundreds of thousands of London workers reasonably healthy in the absence of clean water. This context does not excuse the negligence. It does complicate the picture. The specific engineering of these giant vats is worth understanding because it reveals something about the early industrial period's approach to scale. The great London breweries of the late 18th and early 19th centuries had discovered that they could reduce the cost per barrel of porter by producing it in enormous quantities. Larger vats meant more beer per fermentation cycle, more beer per unit of fuel and labor, better economics of scale in a competitive market. The incentive to build bigger was strong, and the financial rewards were real. What the brewers had not fully accounted for was that the engineering challenges of a vat holding 3,000 barrels were qualitatively different from the challenges of a vat holding 300. The forces involved were not simply larger, they were different in kind, creating failure modes that smaller scale experience had not prepared the brewers or their engineers to anticipate. The giant vats were profitable innovations that were also structurally experiments with consequences that had not been fully thought through. The failure mode in this case was simple: wood and iron age differently. The wooden staves of the vat expanded and contracted with temperature. The iron hoops were supposed to compensate for this movement, maintaining the tension that kept the vat sealed. But over time, with the specific stresses of a vessel that large, holding that much fermenting liquid, the hoops could slip or fail. George Crick, the storehouse clerk, had noticed that one of the 700-pound iron hoops had slipped off the vat that afternoon. He noted it in a message to the brewery's partners. He was not alarmed. Hoops slipped fairly regularly, he later testified, 2 or 3 times a year, and it had never previously caused a problem. He was holding the message when the vat gave way. The vat did not simply leak, it ruptured with sufficient force to trigger a chain reaction among the adjacent vats. The escaping liquid struck the neighboring vessels, dislodging their valves and adding their contents to the initial surge. The total volume released somewhere between 128,000 and 323,000 imperial gallons, depending on which accounts are accepted, was moving as a wave, not a trickle. A wave of fermenting porter under pressure in a confined urban space, encountering a brick wall that was not built to withstand hydraulic force of that magnitude. The back wall of the brewery lasted approximately as long as you would expect a brick wall to last against several 100,000 gallons of liquid moving fast. St. Giles was the place the wave entered, and St. Giles was, by any measure, one of the worst places in London to be when anything catastrophic happened. The St. Giles rookery being the period term for a dense urban slum, covered approximately 8 acres behind and around the brewery. It was one of the most densely populated areas in London, which in 1814 was already one of the most densely populated cities in the world. The buildings were old and poorly maintained, subdivided and subdivided again as the population pressure increased, with families occupying single rooms and sometimes single corners of rooms. Basements and cellars were living spaces, rented to the poorest residents, the Irish immigrants who had come to London in search of work and found themselves at the bottom of every hierarchy the city contained, crowded into the spaces below ground level, where the light barely reached, and the floods, when they came first. The neighborhood was so notorious that William Hogarth had used it as the setting for his 1851 print, Gin Lane, the most famous visual document of urban poverty in English art, a image of a neighborhood so degraded by poverty and drink that it had ceased to function as a human community. By 1814, 60 years after Hogarth, it had not improved. The Irish population that predominated in the area around the brewery had come from a country in the early stages of the crisis that would produce the Great Famine 30 years later, seeking work in the world's first industrial city and finding the specific combination of labor without security that the industrial city offered its poorest workers. They lived in the cellars because cellars were what they could afford. The Irish community in St. Giles in 1814 was there partly by economic necessity and partly by the geography of London's labor market. Irish migrants came to London primarily for construction work. They were among the primary laborers building the infrastructure of the industrial city, digging canals, laying roads, constructing the docks and warehouses that made London the commercial center of the world's largest empire. The work was physically brutal, poorly paid, and entirely without security. When the work stopped, the workers had nothing. When they were injured, they had nothing. When the industrial machinery of the city produced disasters like the one on October 17th, they had nothing. The Irish presence in St. Giles was not a sign of Irish failure. It was a sign of how the industrial city used the labor of its most vulnerable workers and provided nothing in return for the risks they bore. This combination, enormous industrial vessels full of liquid under pressure, positioned directly adjacent to a densely populated slum of basement dwelling workers, was not the product of any single bad decision. It was the product of how industrial London had grown, without zoning, without safety regulation, without any legal framework that required industrial operations to account for the risk they posed to their neighbors. The brewery had been there first. In many respects, the neighborhood had grown up around it, attracted by the work it provided. But the specific proximity of the largest fermentation vats in England to the most vulnerable housing in London was not an accident of fate. It was a consequence of the way the industrial city organized itself, with profit and poverty in close physical contact and no legal mechanism to manage the risk that proximity created. Act 2: The Flood and the Dead. The wave hit New Street and George Street within minutes of the brewery wall collapsing. Contemporary accounts describe a scene of almost impossible disorientation, a 15-foot wall of dark liquid moving through narrow streets designed for foot traffic and horse carts, filling the spaces between buildings, pouring into basements and cellar windows, carrying with it the debris of the collapsed brewery wall and the structural elements of the buildings it struck. The sound of the vat rupturing was described by multiple witnesses as an explosion, a deep percussive boom that shook windows and brought people to their doors across a wide area. One account compared it to a cannon shot. The sound of the brewery wall collapsing followed immediately, a lower, grinding sound, the sound of brick giving way to hydraulic force. Then the sound of the beer itself, moving through the streets, a deep, rushing sound, the specific noise of a large volume of liquid moving fast through a confined space, accompanied by the secondary sounds of debris, broken wood, scattered bricks, the fragmenting of the brewery's interior structures. And then, quickly, the sounds of the neighborhood responding, shouts, screams, the particular human noise of sudden catastrophe arriving in a crowded place. The 5 miles over which the initial explosion was heard tells you something about the scale of what had happened. The neighborhood in the immediate aftermath tells you something about what it meant for the people who were closest to it. 2 houses collapsed. The basements of others were flooded to depths of several feet. The beer, fermenting and therefore warm, had a specific quality that survivors described. It was not simply cold water. It was dark, thick, pungent, moving under its own pressure, filling spaces faster than anyone could react. The people in the basements of the affected buildings had no warning and no route of escape. The flood arrived before the sound of it had fully registered. In the cellar apartment on New Street, where Anne Saville was holding the wake for her 2-year-old son, 5 people died. Anne Saville herself survived. The accounts that describe this are fragmentary and have been retold differently in different sources, but the essential picture is consistent. A small gathering of Irish women keeping vigil over a child's body, killed by the flood before they could reach safety. The specific cruelty of it, that the dead child in the room was joined within minutes by the women who had come to mourn him, is the detail that gives the London beer flood its particular quality of darkness beneath the stam. Absurdity. Mary Banfield and her 4-year-old daughter Hannah, taking tea upstairs in the same building, were also killed. The structural collapse of the ground floor when the flood hit the foundations was immediate. Whether they died in the collapse or in the flood itself is not clear from the surviving accounts. The building came down around them. Eleanor Cooper, a 14-year-old girl, was killed in the street. A bricklayer named Thomas Mulvey also died, though accounts of the circumstances vary. An elderly woman named Hannah Banfield, no relation to Mary Banfield, as far as the records show, despite the identical surname, died of what the coroner's inquest described as fright, a Victorian medical category that covered the range of cardiac and shock-related deaths that could follow an extreme sudden trauma. She was 65 years old. The total confirmed dead numbered 8. Given the density of the neighborhood and the number of basement dwellings in the immediate area, some historians have suggested that the actual death toll may have been higher, with additional victims not reported for various reasons: fear of legal complications, the informal status of some residents, the general chaos of a neighborhood in which the infrastructure for recording deaths was already inadequate. The official number of 8 has been the consistent figure in all contemporary accounts, but it should be understood in the context of a population that was not always well documented at the best of times. The scene immediately after the flood has a quality that the contemporary accounts capture with considerable vividness. The streets were running with dark beer. The smell was overwhelming. Fermenting porter is not a pleasant smell in enclosed spaces, and the combination of it with the debris of collapsed buildings, with the shock and the grief, created a sensory landscape that witnesses described as unlike anything they had previously encountered. People waded through the beer, trying to reach the affected buildings. Others arrived and simply stopped, unable to process what they were seeing. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood and then through the city, as word does in a densely populated urban space. Crowds gathered. The brewery watchman, apparently recognizing an opportunity in the general confusion, began charging people a fee to view the remains of the ruptured vats. Several hundred spectators paid to see the wreckage. The bodies of those killed were laid out in a nearby yard, and the public came to view them, donating money for the funerals. The mourners who had been killed in the cellar were given a second wake at the Ship Public House on Bainbridge Street, an event that has acquired a slightly tragicomic quality in subsequent retellings of the story, but that was, at the time, simply the community doing what communities do with their dead. The flood itself subsided as the beer spread through the streets and seeped into the ground. Some residents, living in the specific conditions of the St. Giles rookery, reportedly scooped the beer from the gutters and drank it. This detail, which appears in several accounts, has been treated with varying degrees of credulity by historians. It is certainly possible the people of St. Giles were not in a position to waste a resource that had come to them, however it had come. Whether the story is literally true, or whether it is the kind of story that attaches itself to events like this, the dark comedy that a watching world imposes on a tragedy it cannot fully absorb, is difficult to determine. The newspaper coverage of the flood in the days following is itself revealing about how the event was understood by the broader public. The Times of London reported it as a disaster, listing the dead and describing the damage. Other papers noted the numbers with varying degrees of detail, but the framing in much of the coverage, even the more sympathetic accounts, treated the event primarily as a curiosity, a spectacular industrial accident in a neighborhood whose residents were understood to be at the margins of respectable society. The St. Giles Rookery was not a place that generated much sympathy from the middle class readership of London's newspapers. Its residents were poor, Irish, Catholic, and associated in the public mind with the most degraded forms of urban poverty. The beer flood was terrible, the coverage implied, but it had happened to people who were already living in circumstances so desperate that a flood of beer was simply one more catastrophe in a long catalog of catastrophes. The specific humanity of Anne Saville mourning her son, of Mary Banfield and Hannah at their tea, did not register in the broader public discourse the way it would have registered if the flood had reached the middle class houses on Great Russell Street instead. Act 3: The Inquest, the Law, and What It Means. The coroner's inquest into the deaths caused by the London beer flood returned a verdict of accidental death. The brewery was taken to court. The court ruled that the accident was an act of God, a legal category that, in English common law, referred to events caused by natural forces beyond human control or prediction, for which no party could be held legally responsible. An act of God. The legal reasoning that produced this verdict was not, by the standards of the time, obviously wrong. The concept of negligence as a basis for civil liability was in its early stages of development in English law in 1814. The idea that a brewery could be held responsible for the failure of a fermentation vat, that the specific decision to build an enormous wooden vat next to a slum, to fill it with hundreds of thousands of gallons of fermenting liquid, to fail to respond adequately to warning signs of structural failure, could constitute a legal wrong for which compensation was owed, was not yet established legal doctrine. The brewery had not intended the flood. The failure of the hoop was not predicted. The case for negligence was not obvious within the legal framework of the time. But the legal outcome was not simply neutral, it was actively beneficial to the brewery. Not only were they freed from liability for the deaths and property damage, but they successfully petitioned Parliament for the return of the excise duty they had already paid on the lost beer. Parliament granted this, the rationale being that the duty had been paid on product that the brewery no longer had and could not sell. They also received additional compensation. The total financial benefit to the brewery from the legal proceedings was substantial enough to prevent what might otherwise have been bankruptcy. The victims' families received nothing, no compensation, no formal acknowledgement of responsibility. The children who had lost their mothers, the husbands who had lost their wives, the neighbors who had lost their community members, they had the donations that the public had made at the impromptu exhibitions of the bodies and the wreckage, and whatever the community itself could provide, and nothing else. The law had spoken, and the law said, "Act of God, no liability, and here is your excise duty back." The London beer flood is often told as a funny story, and there is something to that instinct. The juxtaposition of beer, convivial, ordinary, the drink of workers after a long day with sudden catastrophic death, has a quality of cosmic absurdity that the mind reaches for as a way of processing the event. The 19th century noticed this quality immediately. The flood was reported widely, including in papers that found the subject amusing, and it has accumulated a comedic patina over the 2 centuries since. The beer, the flood, the people scooping beer from the gutters, the wake that was interrupted by a flood and then reconstituted in a pub. It is, on its surface, the kind of story that makes people shake their heads and almost smile. But the comedy is the surface. Underneath it is a story about 8 specific people, most of whom were among the most vulnerable residents of the most dangerous neighborhood in one of the most dangerous cities in the world. Anne Saville had lost her 2-year-old son the previous day. She was in the process of mourning him with the support of the community she depended on when the brewery wall gave way and took 4 of those community members. She survived both bereavements. The specific texture of what the rest of her life looked like after that Monday afternoon is not recorded. The historical record does not follow her. There is a specific dynamic that applies to disasters with absurd elements, and the beer flood illustrates it clearly. When the primary agent of destruction is something ridiculous beer rather than fire, flood rather than explosion, a slipped iron hoop rather than a calculated attack, the absurdity provides emotional cover. It allows the mind to process the event at a slight remove, to find the joke before it finds the grief. This is not a bad instinct. It is a way of managing the cognitive load of terrible things. But it has a cost, which is that the specific people killed tend to get lost behind the ridiculous mechanism of their deaths. The beer flood is a story about beer. It is also a story about Anne Saville's son, who was 2 years old and died the day before. Both of these things are true, and the one that gets remembered is the beer. Mary Banfield was having tea with her daughter when their house came down on them. The 4-year-old Hannah was 4 years old. These are the simplest possible facts, and they resist the comedic framing that the beer angle encourages, which is perhaps why they get mentioned less often in the retellings. The beer is funny. The 4-year-old is not. The broader context of the London beer flood is the context of the early industrial city and its specific relationship to the bodies of its poorest residents. London in 1814 was in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution that would transform it into the largest city in the world by the middle of the 19th century. That transformation was powered by working class labor and concentrated in working class neighborhoods, and the risks it created: industrial accidents, disease, structural collapse, pollution were borne disproportionately by the people who lived closest to the machinery. The Horseshoe Brewery was not unusual in sitting adjacent to a residential neighborhood. That was how London was built. Every major industrial operation was surrounded by workers who lived within its shadow, who breathed its fumes, who were subject to its failures, and who had, in 1814, essentially no legal recourse when those failures killed them. 1814 was, in many ways, a year of endings and beginnings. The Napoleonic Wars were concluding. Napoleon had abdicated in April, and the Peace of Paris had been signed in May. Europe was reorganizing itself after more than 2 decades of warfare. In London, the mood was optimistic in ways that the population of St. Giles did not fully share. The economic disruptions of the war years had been hard on the poor in particular. The demobilization of hundreds of thousands of soldiers returning from the continent would, within a year, add to the surplus of labor that was already depressing wages for the kind of work that the St. Plan's Giles community depended on. The year that began with peace ended for 8 people in a slum behind a brewery with a flood of dark beer on an October afternoon. The optimism of the peace was not evenly distributed. The cost of the industrial city was not evenly distributed. The beer flood illustrates both of these things in a single event. The act of God doctrine that freed the brewery from liability was not an aberration of the legal system. It was a feature of it. The law in 1814 had not yet developed the concepts of negligence and duty of care that would eventually allow courts to hold industrial operators responsible for foreseeable risks to their neighbors. Those concepts would develop slowly and unevenly over the course of the 19th century, driven partly by the accumulated experience of industrial accidents and the reform movements they generated. The Moe brewery flood was not directly responsible for legal reform. It was too quickly forgotten, too quickly absorbed into the general catalog of industrial era disasters. But it was part of the landscape of events that eventually produced a legal culture willing to hold industry accountable. The specific legal case of the beer flood sits at an interesting moment in the history of English tort law. The concept that would eventually allow injured parties to sue for damages caused by industrial negligence, the idea that an operator has a duty of care to those affected by their operations, was articulated most clearly in the Semry. English courts in the 1860s, in cases like Rylands v. Fletcher, which established the principle that a person who brings onto their land something likely to do mischief if it escapes must keep it at their peril and is prima facie answerable for all the damage which is the natural consequence of its escape. Thousands of gallons of fermenting beer under pressure in a wooden vat next to a residential slum is, by this principle, exactly the kind of thing that must be kept at one's peril. But Rylands v. Fletcher was decided in 1868, 54 years after the beer flood. The legal concept that would have made the brewery responsible did not exist when the flood occurred. The victims existed in the gap between the industrial capacity to cause harm and the legal capacity to assign responsibility for it. The Horseshoe Brewery continued to operate after the flood. It was taken over and renamed multiple times over the following century, eventually becoming the Dominion Theatre, the large music venue that currently stands at the corner of Tottenham Court Road and New Street. If you have ever walked past the Dominion Theatre or attended a show there, you were standing on the ground where the beer ran in 1814, where the brewery wall collapsed, where the wave moved toward the neighborhood behind. There is no plaque. There is no memorial. The St. Giles Rookery was cleared in the middle of the 19th century as part of a slum clearance program. Its inhabitants dispersed to other overcrowded neighborhoods, and the area was rebuilt. The geography of the disaster is still visible in the street grid, but the disaster itself is invisible. The brewery rebuilt. The damaged vats were repaired or replaced. Production resumed. The excise refund and parliamentary compensation kept the company solvent. Within a few years, the event had faded from public consciousness to the degree that it became a story told occasionally in London pubs, rather than a scandal that shaped policy. No new safety regulations were passed in response to the flood. No inspection regime was created for industrial fermentation vessels. No requirement was imposed on breweries to maintain safe distances from residential buildings. The specific combination of circumstances that had produced the disaster, enormous vats under pressure, adjacent to dense residential housing, with no legal framework requiring accountability for foreseeable risk, remained unchanged. The next industrial disaster in London would find the same legal and regulatory landscape that the beer flood victims had found, which is to say, no protection, no remedy, and an act of God to explain away the consequences. The Dominion Theatre on Tottenham Court Road hosts musicals. People queue outside it on weekend evenings in their good clothes, waiting to see spectacles designed to move them or delight them, or both. The site of the Horseshoe Brewery is now a place of deliberate entertainment, which is either ironic or appropriate, depending on how you look at it. The street grid still runs the way it ran in 1814. New Street is still there, renamed and restructured, but still traceable. The neighborhood that was St. Giles is now Bloomsbury and Covent Garden, gentrified beyond recognition, home to universities and museums and boutique hotels and restaurants where a meal costs more than a week's wages for the people who lived in the cellars of New Street. The city has metabolized its industrial past, the way cities metabolize everything, converting it into something that looks like always having been there. The beer is long gone. The people are long gone. The law that let the brewery walk away has been replaced by one that would not, though the application of that law remains, in practice, uneven in ways that would not entirely surprise Anne Saville. 8 people, on a Monday afternoon, in the middle of the most ordinary things, mourning a child, drinking tea, going about the work of living in a difficult place. A 700-pound iron hoop slipped, a vat ruptured, a wall came down. The law said, "Act of God." And the city moved on, the way cities always move on, absorbing its casualties into the general account of what it costs to live in the place where the machines are. That's what Strange Epics is: stories that have no clean endings, moments that history recorded but never quite explained, events that happened, undeniably happened, and yet still somehow feel impossible. Everything you heard in this episode is real. Every name, every date, every detail drawn from documented historical sources. All of the sources for this episode are listed in the episode description below. I encourage you to look them up. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow Strange Epochs wherever you listen. New episodes drop every Tuesday. And if you want to help the show grow, leaving a review goes a long way. It really does. I'll see you next week. I'm Sean Spainhour. This is Strange Epochs.